This is Fortress on a Hill. Thank you for joining us. I'm Henry.
And I'm Danny. We're here to tear apart recent stories about our nation's armed forces and our veterans.
We hope you'll take a critical look at what's happening with our military, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Now, let's get started. All right, everybody. So this is our first pod back after the About Face convention that I attended a couple of weeks back in the beginning part of August. We were just south of Seattle at a really cool little retreat with some great people who are very, very, very serious veterans, activists from a number of political persuasions, and we'll talk about that later. But as always, we've got to fill you in on the very, very demoralizing headlines. Me and Henry have said a million times that there's more for us to talk about than we could possibly cover in any given podcast episode. So we've actually gone down in some ways and done less headlines and tried to go a little more thorough on each of those. This week, I think we have to talk about Yemen. We've done an entire show on Yemen. We've done 2 or 3 different segments on Yemen. But for once, Yemen broke into the news just a little a week back, and that is when a Saudi airstrike, which we must always qualify with a U.S.-supported Saudi airstrike, killed at least 40 and maybe 51 Yemeni children on a school bus on the way to a field trip. And this is really just a tiny speck of the catastrophe that's happening every single day in Yemen. But what stands out to me is this was children on a school trip. This stands out as something particularly horrific that can hopefully spark a conversation. The conversation that I want to have is, why in the world is the United States Air Force, why in the world is the United States intelligence community supporting the Saudi tyrants, the tyrannical Saudi Islamists who behead women in their own country and who are terror bombing the Yemeni people into submission? Why would we continue to support that? And why isn't there the political courage in Congress to stand up and vote against funding this war? Because as long as we continue to fund it, we are complicit. And complicity is guilt. We tried. Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut. Rand Paul, totally on the other side, Republican from Kentucky. They tried to throw together a bipartisan bill a few months back to cut off congressional funding to the Saudi war of aggression in Yemen. And what happened? We got about 35 votes. Couldn't even muster a majority, let alone the necessary supermajority in the Senate. So what does that tell us? It tells us we live in a country of political cowards. It tells us that our elected representatives will not do what is ethically and strategically, right? Ethically and strategically correct, which is to pull all U.S. support from this Saudi war of terror in Yemen. We're so big on saying, oh, we're fighting the war on terror. That was 17 years ago we started talking about that. I don't know, we've renamed it a few times, but people still talk about the war on terror. What happens when you're making war on people in a way that is terror-filled? What happens then? And that's a question we have to be willing to ask, and too often we're not willing to have that question. So, you know, Henry, I don't know what you thought of this story. It brought so much to my head. I don't think I could possibly get it all out in one segment.
I listened to Scott Horton's show. I think it was from the 6th, where he spoke with Iona Craig about recent reporting that she's done, and it wasn't so much that the statistics she added, which were horrifying, or and it was more about her demeanor. This is a journalist who's traveled to Yemen many, many times and seen the horrors there, and she was beside herself about what was currently happening. That it has gotten substantially worse. With the bombing of that Corella treatment center, and then this, and what justification can anyone possibly give for that being any kind of a tactical target, except for we hate these people and we're okay with as many of them dying as we like?
Right. Well, and we spoke to her as well, of course, and so we we're very familiar with the passion that she brings to the
Oh
table.
yeah, she's awesome.
We are very, very familiar with her passion on this subject, and for her to be that upset, to me, is indicative of something, is it not? Um, the fact that she is that horrified tells you that this must have been a low blow. This must have been a particularly bad strike. And I'll tell you, one of the ways that I knew that something was afoot here is that you actually saw the faces of the Yemeni children on TV for maybe the first time. Um, Not as much as I would have liked, of course, but for once there were actually Yemeni children's faces on TV, because that's not how we normally do it, is it? We're always concerning ourselves with Belgian children, for example, who die in a terrorist attack, right? But they look like us; they're Caucasian, okay? So they matter, right? Or maybe we'll see French children who were killed in one of the latest terror attacks in like Nice, France, and and we have empathy for them, and we should have empathy for them. But there's an empathy gap normally. I was happy to see that in this individual case, the Yemeni children did get a hearing on television, at least to some extent, and we're starting to talk about it. But here's the bad part: I don't think that the political courage exists in our current Congress to do anything serious about this. I don't think there's any chance, really, that that anyone in Congress is going to shut this war down. The political courage just isn't there. I mean, unless I'm missing something, man, I just don't see it. What do you think?
No, I don't think it's there either. The language that was inserted into the new National Defense Authorization Act was very weak on reporting as far as what's happening there in Yemen. And again, even if it was robust, even if it was written well, who's going to fuel it? What political courage is going to fuel the drive to go and actually question this, even though there's plenty of reason to do that. Not the least of which is that I think it was Zero Hedge that reported that MSNBC reported how many times on Stormy Daniels and
Yeah,
zero
right.
times on what's happening in Yemen. And I get that news these days is so much about what's happening at the moment and how much can we churn the butter in this fucking moment to get the most out of it. But that doesn't actually tell people stories. That's just about what's flashy. And so we miss so much, not even just defense news, but all other kinds of news because of that mentality. Because for some reason, the Rachel Maddows have decided that Russiagate and all of its elements are more important than actual people dying. And I
100%.
I can't find that acceptable in the fucking least.
It's really interesting that you brought up Rachel Maddow, because I'm working on a piece this week that'll appear in Anti-War probably next Tuesday. I'm back to weekly columns on Anti-War, by the way, listeners. My first Tuesday article came out this week, which is a whole other subject that I will talk about when I am out of the Army. But hint, hint, it involves an investigation of yours truly and my obviously unpatriotic writing. So stay tuned. I'm going to keep my mouth shut until I get my retirement and until my medical comes through, I should say. And then we're going to have a lot to talk about.
Sounds good.
But,
Sounds good.
you're right. Stormy Daniels gets mentioned over and over and over. Any sort of sordid sexual, topic tends to do really, really well in the news, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And anything anti-Trump does particularly well. And I'm the last person who's some sort of big fan of the president. I mean, I don't think anyone would ever accuse me of that
I hope
by
not.
any means. But at the same time, I'm willing to say, look, not everything that this president does deserves critique. And some of the things this president does that do deserve critique don't deserve as much critique as other things, like the criminal war in Yemen. So I think that's where I'm at, sort of on these issues, and it's very frustrating, to say the least. What I will say is, it has been proven that congressmen and senators respond to pressure of sorts. They respond to political pressure and monetary pressure. So if you are of means and capable, lobby your congressman. Okay? If you think what's happening in Yemen is a crime, like we do, then it's time to speak up and kind of put your money and your feet, more importantly, where your mouth is, and actually be an activist rather than just talking about issues on the web, which anybody can do. Anybody can retweet something. Okay, and we're guilty of it. Henry and I do that. Okay, but there needs to be more to it. There needs to be more to it. And so anyway, I think we'll leave Yemen there. But I wish I could tell you we weren't going to come back to Yemen, except that I'm just about positive that we will, because this story isn't going anywhere. It's got legs, and it's not going anywhere.
Absolutely. No, it's something we're going to have to talk about for a long time, and that's really horrifying. So I want to talk about a writer that I follow pretty regularly. His name is Dan Lamothe of the Washington Post, and he writes on a very, very wide assortment of defense news. Stuff starting from the new Pentagon restrictions on Fitbit-type devices, to in order to protect installation security, to the returned remains of U.S. troops repatriated from North Korea. Now, he regularly travels with SecDef Mattis on some of his trips to meet with foreign leaders and visit U.S. troops. And as far as I can tell, in the nature of his writing, is that he works really hard to be an honest broker of defense news. He's equally critical of everybody as far as I can tell. And that's what makes the next part of this story so infuriating. Politico reported recently that there had been a string of retaliation moves by Pentagon media staff against defense reporters from various outlets. Even Defense One, which is literally sponsored by Lockheed Martin, weren't invited to a routine press conference because their reporting on a roundtable discussing Trump's new Space Force bullshit came out before the Pentagon was ready for it. Now, this is in addition to an investigation against Trump appointee and Pentagon press chief Dana White, who's been accused of using her own staff for personal errands and retaliating against them when they complain. But back to Dan's story. Dan didn't get missed for an invite to a briefing or get excluded from an off-the-record meeting with Mattis, as has happened to others. His cost was much worse. Dan, with his place at the Washington Post, had secured an invitation to embed with U.S. Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan, which it's not an easy thing to get approved for or even to plan it once it's approved. Reporters embed in lots of U.S. military units around the world. I've even given a lift to a few during my time in Iraq, but doing this kind of stuff with Special Ops Forces is an entirely different ballgame. Their missions are tougher and more dangerous. They go over tougher terrain. They're usually going against the worst guys. So it's a very big honor and a big endeavor to do something like this. And I'm guessing that Dan probably spent months preparing for the assignment. The retaliation against Dan was to have his embed assignment nixed at the last minute. He was already in country, in Afghanistan, when he was told about losing the assignment. He ended up having to come back to the States, and then he returned to Afghanistan a bit later to do an embed with the newly minted 1st Security Assistance Brigade, which is one of those new quasi-special forces advise and assist brigades. They're not special forces, but they do some of the missions that special forces usually do. Now, the mainstream media already downplays a great portion of major military news of all subjects. We shared, Danny and I recently talked about the photo of an almost empty Pentagon press room for a briefing on, let's guess, Afghanistan. Clearly, very few media outlets are willing to do critical stories of the military. But this right here, this is an entirely different level. We need reporters embedded in units of all types to tell the stories of ordinary troops and their missions. If a months-long planned embed can get nixed at the last minute, what else can be shoved off into the shadows? And just to satiate our curiosity, what was Dan's sin against the Trump administration and their defense appointees? He wrote a fairly stereotypical defense article where he pointed out that increasing Afghan special forces numbers could leave their ordinary combat units undermanned. That's it. That's all he did. And while that decision does follow the Trump pattern of Goebbels-esque media control, this is the first time I've seen that the Pentagon was willing to toss out its own work in support of defense reporters. And going back to me mentioning Defense One at the beginning, when Defense One gets their seat at the table shaken, an outlet that specifically totes the military-industrial complex line, is there any hope for people like Dan and ordinary reporters at the New York Times or the Washington Post? What do you think about that, Danny?
Well, I'm really glad. I mean, this is a great segue into my next talk. But before we get there, I've written for Defense One. I think I've put 2 or 3 articles in Defense One. Normally, I can only get into Defense One if it comes through Defense Priorities, which is a think tank that I'm also affiliated with, libertarian think tank primarily. Defense One is pretty mainstream, like you said. You know, what hope do the New York Times and the Washington Post reporters have if, Defense One, which specifically covers the Pentagon and is, generally on message with the Pentagon, then what chance does the Washington Post or the New York Times have? But I'll take it further and say, what chance does something like The Intercept have? What chance does an alternative media platform that tries to take a different view, what chance do they have of ever getting in the room or ever getting on embed? I mean, almost none. And so the war on the media is not just a war on it's a war on all types of media. And when we should be expanding the media space, in responsible ways, but when we should be expanding the media space in this age of the internet, we're actually contracting it. And it becomes like 1984. You can only report on things if you tote the government line exactly. Because if Defense One is getting kicked off their embeds, then I don't know who's not going to get kicked off. Because, there's some critical material on Defense One, but they focus on the military. They usually argue around the edges. They'll say military strategy in Afghanistan is flawed for X, Y, and Z reasons. They won't say the war in Afghanistan represents militarism and is a terrible crime, right? They're not going to say that. Now, we should let reporters in the room who do say that, okay? Maybe we think it, maybe we don't. But the point is, I want the whole space available for the breadth of the conversation. But Defense One is usually kind of on the mainstream side. So you bring up a really great point, which leads us to my first outlet that I really started writing for. I placed a piece in the Kansas City Star like years ago, and I placed a piece on a sort of left-wing site called Who, What, Why, but I really struggled to get my first articles out. But a guy named Tom Engelhart, New Yorker, lifelong New Yorker, been in the editing business for, I don't want to say too low of a number, but at least 40 years, okay? Pantheon Books, The Nation, this guy is all that, written about 5 books. Well, Tom Engelhart, some years back when he retired from his day job as an editor, started a site called TomDispatch.com. And Tom gave me a shot when nobody would. And really my writing exploded from there. Like, I'm not all that yet, but I never write anything that doesn't publish anymore, and I really do have Tom to thank. The thing that's most interesting about TomDispatch and Tom Engelhart's editing in general is that he only accepts long-form analytical pieces. You will not publish on TomDispatch.com unless you follow 2 criteria. You write at least 2,000 words, give or take, and you let Tom personally edit the piece for content. Okay? Tom edits everything himself. He doesn't have editors. He edits himself. He has some line editors and some copy editors who go through the commas and the semicolons. But Tom does all the content editing himself, and he's a tough editor. Tom does not let anything to his pieces that is not cited specifically with a link to a creditable source, and Tom doesn't allow any shenanigans on his site. Sure, you can use flippant language. Sure, he wants you to come as a hard-hitting writer. But Tom is based on facts, and Tom wants analytical pieces. And in a media space that has been drilled down to 140 or 280 characters with emojis, Tom represents the last charge or the last stand of the old type of journalism, long-form, 2,000, 2,500 word pieces. I've read probably 500 pieces on TomDispatch since I became a fan about 7 years ago. I imagine you've probably read dozens at least, right, Henry?
Oh, yeah, I've read a ton of them.
And never once has there been a hateful or racist word published. And I'm not surprised, because Tom is such a tough editor, he would never allow that. But just the other day, for the first time in my military career, I've read TomDispatch before on government computers, on personal computers, for years, okay? I tried to go to TomDispatch.com, and it was blocked by the Department of Defense censors. And they actually give a reason. They give a justification when a website is blocked. And the reason for TomDispatch being blocked by the Department of Defense right now is, quote, hate and racism. Well, I challenge anyone to find hate or racism in a TomDispatch piece. I've never seen it. Now, what TomDispatch is generally left-leaning, if we're fair. If we're fair, we have to admit that. It's generally anti-war, it's generally critical about the wars, and it's generally probably left-leaning, although there's a variety of writers, and Tom would probably hate it for me to say it's left-leaning, but if we were going to be fair to the military, probably it is left-leaning. But it is far from hateful, It is incredibly well cited. I mean, it's almost annoying how well you have to cite and how detailed your facts have to be in order to get on TomDispatch, because he's a tough editor. Um, but the Department of Defense says you can't go to TomDispatch.com. You also can't go to The Intercept, I found out, because it got curious. I started getting curious. I said, well, if Tom isn't allowed, then who else isn't allowed? I found out that The Intercept isn't either. So then I thought, well, I better go check on the right-wing sites. In fact, I'll choose the kookiest right-wing sites, the most conspiracy theorist, alt-right sites I can think of, because certainly, of course, they must be blocked too. If a mainstream, long-form, analytical, slightly left-wing site like TomDispatch.com is blocked, then most certainly Breitbart must be. Wrong. You can get to Breitbart on a Department of Defense computer. Well, Breitbart's bad. They've had some pretty rough headlines over the years. Racist, anti-Semitic, misogynistic. I mean, Breitbart, I could just Google Breitbart 25 craziest headlines. They'll blow your mind. But okay, so Breitbart's allowed. But certainly InfoWars, right? Alex Jones, there's no way that this kook who says that the shooting in Connecticut didn't actually happen at that school, and that the bleeding children were actually actors, and certainly the guy who has laid one conspiracy theory after another onto the table, and who's actually been banned by Facebook and Twitter now. Certainly, InfoWars with Alex Jones must be blocked on the Department of Defense website. But I was wrong again. You may visit Breitbart and you may visit InfoWars, but you may not visit The Intercept or TomDispatch.com, which leads me to only one conclusion. I haven't spoken to the Department of Defense about this. I haven't spoken to the people who make these decisions. I don't even know who makes decisions. But the only logical conclusion one can draw from the information I just laid out for you is this. The Department of Defense appears okay with any material of almost any capacity, as long as it's on the right, as long as it's on the political right. But if something is even slightly critical, but analytic and well-cited on the left, maybe it's going to get blocked. Now, for an institution that prides itself on being apolitical, for an institution that prides itself on being center of the road when it comes to politics and nonpartisan, this is shameful. This is shameful. And I'm going to dig deeper. There's probably an article on this coming. I don't know if I'll wait till I'm out of the Army. I might. I'm trying to keep my head down and certainly not ruffle too many more feathers than I've already ruffled, which is a lot. But stay tuned on this topic, because we're coming back to it. To tell you the truth, a quick personal anecdote. When I told Tom personally about his website being blocked, he was horrified. He wasn't surprised, though. And that's interesting. He was horrified because he knows his site is far from racist and far from hateful. So that's what horrified him. But he wasn't surprised. And he said to me, he said, Danny, this is the U.S. military we're talking about. I mean, give me a break. Don't be surprised. You know, he was almost shocked that I feigned surprise. But it wasn't feigned. It was real. I just thought, if anybody would be allowed in the discourse on war and militarism and foreign policy, it would be Tom, because his site is really such a gem and such, I'd say, a national treasure. But that's the last thing I want to say about that for now. But stay tuned in my writing and also in me and Henry's future broadcast, because we are going to come back to this issue of censorship within the DOD.
It's an odd category to put on TomDispatch, just period. I've seen lots of YouTube channels and videos get taken down, and they'll label them as like political extremism, which is a good bit wider than just hate and racism. So somewhere somebody's deciding these categories to put them in, and deciding, because even if they think it's a lie, even if they think it's full of crap, which stuff from Breitbart is or can be, they still want people to see that stuff. But the stuff that they think is full of crap but possibly true, critical of the military, critical of all these other things, yeah, that has to get labeled under hate and racism. And at a certain point, we're going to have who gets invited to the table in those discussions. Granted, this is, again, like you said, we don't even know who makes these category decisions. So,
yeah, I don't pretend to know, and I'm going to look into it, because I think I owe it to the listeners, as a quasi-journalist or whatever the heck I am, commentator. I do owe you guys a better answer on who makes these decisions, what level they're made at, and what criteria go into it. But just as a surface look, and a quick search of a few crazy sites on the right, it really does appear shocking, and I think it needs to be out in the open. I think this is a discussion that we need to have. Certainly, the Department of Defense has the right to block certain sites. I mean, it's very reasonable not to have soldiers looking at pornography or white supremacist websites, for example, while they're on duty. But we are encouraged to read credible news sources. We are encouraged to read critical articles. At least theoretically, I've been told that by senior officers. So our government network computers do need to be exposed to a variety of opinions and a variety of analysis. And it just appears that that's not true. At least under the current administration, it appears that it's not true. Breitbart and Infowars, which have one thing in common, and that is they're generally pretty pro Donald Trump, right? I mean, that's what there's a lot of other things we could say about both those sites. Okay, there are a lot of things, but one thing they definitely both are is generally pro Donald Trump, at least during the election campaign. And so, is it any surprise that they are, of course, not blocked? But the very fact of not blocking the site is basically saying they're okay. Okay, I mean, that's the tacit sort of lesson that you can take from it, and it's really disturbing. But on a brighter note, I just want to spend a few minutes. I'm not going to rant on and on about this, talking about About Face. About Face, you've heard us mention it before on the show. Henry and I are both members. It used to be called Iraq Veterans Against the War, IVAW. It was formed actually in really, I think, early 2004 by a couple of young male and female, enlisted and officer, Iraq war combat vets, most of whom were in the invasion, most of whom were in the 2003 invasion, who came home. Many of them got out of the military. Some were in the National Guard, some were in the Reserve, some were active duty, some were Marines, some were Army, Navy. I mean, there's a really good cross-section. But this group of patriotic Americans who had served their country in a time of war said something is wrong. Something doesn't smell right about this Iraq war that I've been a part of. And so they started an organization, and they said IVAW. And the reason they came up with IVAW is because they were looking at the legacy of military dissent. And they thought about the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, the VAW, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, became a potent political force, marching on Washington and just, all kinds of political activity. So they form IVAW. And it's a relatively small organization, although it has grown over the years. And some years back, I believe two conventions ago, IVAW decided to widen their brand. They said, we have veterans now, not just from the Iraq War, but also from the Afghan War, which has also gone on for 17 years, which has also gone on for far too long, in the opinion of the organization, in the opinion of the board. And we also have veterans from Yemen and Pakistan and Libya. I mean, the war on terror, which has often become a war of terror, the war on terror has spread far and wide. So they wanted to open it up. So About Face is now called About Face, Veterans Against the War. And they had their convention from the 2nd to the 6th of August, just south of Seattle, in a national forest that belongs to the University of Washington, just really at the base of Mount Rainier. It was incredibly beautiful, and it looked like a summer camp. I went out there for the convention in an unofficial capacity, not on behalf of the Department of Defense, not on behalf of the Department of the Army. Let me be clear about that. In an unofficial capacity, I'm not a member of the board. I wasn't a speaking role. I wasn't in a leadership role. I'm not going to do that, of course, while I'm in uniform. But I was there as an observer. I was there as a learner. And what I found is that this is an organization worth looking into for all the veteran listeners out there. And I know a lot of our listeners are veterans or the family members of veterans. And the anti-war movement has not had the horsepower in the post-2001 era as it had during the Vietnam era. There's a lot of reasons for that. The main one is probably the lack of a draft, a lack of conscription. Because the vast majority of Americans don't have any skin in the game. The vast majority of Americans don't care about these wars because they don't have to serve in them if they do not choose to. See, we're all volunteers, so it's easy to not feel so bad for us and say, well, he volunteered. It was his choice to go. He has no right to complain about the war. Now, I disagree with that on an intellectual level. I mean, it's a terrible slippery slope argument. It's ad hominem. It doesn't make sense on any level. But this is something we're told. And the vast majority of American college students, American high school graduates, don't care about the war because they are too busy watching the Kardashians and looking at their phones, and because they do not have to serve. But there's also apathy in general. I would argue that there's a cultural apathy that has come with this internet generation, called the millennial generation. I guess I'm just on the cusp of being a millennial. I'm not anti-millennial, but I think there's something to the political apathy of many people in this generation. And for the most part, veterans have been quiet too. And that's disturbing because I think there are a lot of really astute veterans out there who have their doubts about their tour or their tours, about what they did, about what they were asked to do, about what they were capable of doing, about whether the mission they were given was impossible. And I would encourage those veterans. I'm not going to say go out and join About Face. And I'm certainly not going to use my rank or status in the military to say that. But it's something worth looking into. I found these to be very interesting people. I was proud to stand among them, proud to do it in the future. They are planning future activities. They were going to protest the Trump military parade on November 10th, but as we know, that has been delayed, I think, until further notice, if I'm not mistaken. We can talk about that in another episode. But at the convention, what we did mostly was we didn't stand around and sing songs and chant all day. It wasn't like a commune of sorts where we all sat around and held hands. We educated ourselves. There were speakers on topics that ranged from militarism to patriarchy to racism. We talked about white supremacy. We talked about organizational tools. We talked about masculinity. We talked about trans rights. We talked about poverty. We talked about imperialism, and we talked about capitalism. This is an intersectional 21st century movement, okay? This is not your dad's anti-war movement. This is not your grandfather's anti-war movement. This is a 21st century diverse male, female, cisgender, and otherwise organization that cares about intersectional issues that range from patriarchy to racism. Because what they realize is the seeds of militarism that allow for the longest wars in our history go much deeper than just the military or just veterans issues or just foreign policy. It's all tied into the broader culture of white supremacy and of male chauvinism and of late-stage exploitative capitalism. Now, I don't mean to give the impression that these guys are all wild lefties. Not everyone agrees on every issue. What they have in common is they are all veterans. They are almost all combat veterans. They range from the Air Force to the Army. They range from male to female. They range from, PFCs and conscientious objectors all the way up to captains, majors, and colonels. The convention was an absolute delight. I'll be going in the future. I'll be likely more active in the organization when I am capable of doing so and when I'm no longer on active duty. And I just wanted our listeners to hear about it. About Face, Veterans Against the War, not your grandfather's anti-war movement. Something new, something fresh. Check out their website. They have a donations area. They have an information area. They have a leadership area. They're active across the country with chapters from the West Coast to the East Coast, north to south, Canada to the border with Mexico. So, check them out. There's so much great information out there, and it was really a pleasure to be at the convention just 2 weeks ago.
Sounds awesome, brother. I was sucked that I couldn't go, but I'm really glad that you got the chance to go and speak to those guys and network with them. And speaking of them, I don't know, we won't need to get into this in any detail, but did you happen to speak to Brittany about her investigation situation?
Yeah, so we're talking about Brittany DeBarros, who is an Army Reserve captain. She was previously on active duty. I believe she's finishing out her reserve years with, I think, the intent to leave the military once her time is up or potentially before. She has caused some controversy of late and been in the news media because she planned before her 14-day drill duty, which I believe was going to happen out in maybe Fort Lewis, but regardless, before her 14-day active activation drill duty that she has to do every year, she planned 14 tweets to go out once a day, which they did. And every one of these tweets just gave a fact about the war on terror, about the military-industrial complex, about militarism more generally. And each of these facts, according to Brittany, and it seems to be the case, were actually pulled from DOD websites or from DOD cited materials. So this is not made up stuff. This is actually the information of the military, of the Pentagon, being used just to make a certain point. The fact that she did so publicly, the fact that she did so while activated, even though she did not do it while she was on duty, she focused on her duties and she had pre-planned all this ahead of time. On her free time, she has become the center of some controversy and of an investigation. I can't say much about that investigation for two reasons. Number one, Brittany's privacy is paramount, and number two, it's ongoing.
Yeah.
What I know is that this very thoughtful, intelligent woman and military officer in Iraq War or Afghan War, I believe, veteran, she's going through tough times. Okay, when the military wants to investigate you, when you cause a controversy, or when you make someone in your chain of command look bad or think they look bad, it can get pretty ugly. And I wish her the best of luck. We're going to talk to her on the pod in a coming week. I did get to talk to her about her investigation. Our conversations were generally private, and I wish her the best. We wish her the best. And I think we have not heard the last of the Brittany DeBarros story, whether it's about these tweets or about a really, really great burgeoning career that she has in whatever she chooses to do, and certainly in activism. She's very involved in the Poor People's Campaign, which is an outgrowth of Martin Luther King's last final event that he had planned before his death. And she's an activist and a veteran and a woman, and we really should stand in solidarity with her, because I think she's going through some tough times right now.
Absolutely. No, I'm glad that you got to meet up with her and chat with her a little bit. And um, I hope that it all just levels out. I hope that it just, it seems so fucking ridiculous to do something like that. Somebody's auto tweets during their annual training. I can't get my head around that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think her big sort of hashtag is resist militarism, and I guess that's not okay. I suppose, I don't know. We'll wait to see what the investigation says. I don't want to speculate what the Department of Defense is going to do. Someone's upset with her expressing these opinions over social media. I will tell you that I found her tweets powerful. Okay, and I think that's worth saying. And so I encourage you to Google Brittany. There are some GoFundMe sites out there. There's some other ways to sort of reach out through the organization of About Face to help her out. I believe that she is getting counsel from a civilian attorney, or at least is potentially planning that. So depending on how far the investigation goes and what actions they take, this is someone who might need support. So of course, I'm not saying that in any official capacity, but this is a great woman that I had the pleasure to meet, and wish her the best.
Awesome. Awesome. I hope that it gets better and turn that bullshit around. So we got to before we get out of here today, guys, we got a few announcements we want to make sure you guys are aware of. Danny, what part are you on in your Truth Digger series?
I just finished part 15, which was on the Mexican-American War, probably one of the more nefarious wars in American history. It really covers everything from the Alamo and the Texas War of Independence up to the fallacious depiction of the war as having begun with Mexican aggression, when actually it happened on what is largely regarded as Mexican soil, and it takes us all the way through the end of the war. We talk about military dissenters, and I really enjoyed this piece. I think it caused some controversy. That's my goal. I'm trying to reframe American history and encourage people to look at it through a different lens. Next Saturday, not this coming Saturday, but 2 weeks, every 2 weeks I put the articles out, I'll be doing the road to the Civil War. So I'll sort of be discussing the 1850s and how America finds itself in a civil war. And after that, I'm going to cover the Civil War itself. So, I mean, it's moving along. Most likely, this Truth Dig series on American history of mine, called American History for Truth Diggers, will probably end up being about 30 to 35 segments, at which point it'll be rolled up into an edited collection and published as a book through Truth Dig and possibly the Nation Institute more specifically. So, stay tuned. TruthDig.com, phenomenal website, great day-to-day commentary from great authors like Chris Hedges. And I write there pretty regularly, and every 2 weeks you can find my American History for Truth Digger series. Stay tuned. Civil War era is coming up.
Sounds great. So for some upcoming episodes, just so you guys are aware, we're going to be recording a sort of online panel about moral injury. And that's going to include myself, Danny, the War Axe, if you guys are familiar with him. He's out prowling around on Twitter. Tyson Manker, who we interviewed earlier this year about his bad paper discharge. And Pastor Josh Morris, who's somebody who reached out to me after he read the moral injury article that I had on anywar.com. And anyways, we wanted to bring together some different points of view on moral injury, some different experiences, and kind of collaborate a little bit and see what we can come up with. We also have coming up, we're going to be doing a dual podcast with Room of Requirement, which, let's see, Age and Wisdom in the Age of Trump, or Truth and Wisdom in the Age of Trump, I think is their hash line. So, but really nice group of guys, and we're going to sit and talk with them about some military topics. And lastly, on the 6th of September, we will be airing our breakdown of September 11, 2001. It's going to be some history, some analysis, some personal stories, but we haven't really discussed that in full detail. So look for that coming up just before the anniversary of September 11th.
And just a reminder for everybody, this is a couple of things are coming up. Obviously, September 11th is coming up. This will be the 17th anniversary.
Yes, I believe
So.
Yeah,
17th anniversary. And November 11th, we'll probably talk more about Veterans Day like we always do. This November 11th is the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day, which is what Veterans Day used to be called. It was the end of World War I. It's supposed to be the war to end all wars. We know how that turned out. There's been just as many wars since World War I as there generally were before. So I know Veterans for Peace is really focusing a lot of their efforts this year on the Armistice Day 100th year anniversary, but something else to keep in mind. We start talking about September 11th is coming up. We got to talk about how do we analyze the September 11th attacks 17 years in the rear view, and then we're going to come to Veterans Day and do sort of the same thing. So I think it's really interesting, especially since Trump was planning a parade for Veterans Day, although it looks like that's been delayed indefinitely. But really some interesting stuff and some interesting anniversaries coming up.
So thanks for joining us today, guys, and we're really glad to be back after our break. Man, I wanted to get some podcasting done, and please come visit us again. Check out some of those upcoming things.
All right, guys, thanks for tuning in. We got a lot more coming.
Thank you for joining us today. Please come join the conversation at www.fortressonahill.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill or on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Fortress on a Hill. We want to hear from our listeners about the topics and issues pertinent to America's military and veteran communities. And last but certainly not least, analyze your news and its sources very closely. Verify everything you read. And remember that no one, no matter how powerful, are above criticism, especially those with the power to send others into harm's way. We'll see you next time.